Alright, hello and welcome to our second World War II PowerPoint. In this PowerPoint we're going to talk a little bit about how the U.S. got involved, how the war changed after the U.S. involved, and a couple other things. So, without further ado, here we go. Alright, so first off, as we go through this PowerPoint, I'd like to have you guys keep this in mind. Had the attack on Pearl Harbor not happened, do you believe that the U.S. would still have entered World War II? What do you think could have caused us to enter into World War II if not for Pearl Harbor? I want you guys to keep that in mind as we go through. Now, before we talk about Pearl Harbor, we need to talk about the Nanjing Massacre. The Nanjing Massacre was a massacre, first off, from December 1937 until January of 1938, in which Japanese troops entered into the city of Nanjing and started to take Chinese citizens as prisoners of war. The Japanese had, at this time, a very racist outlook on the Chinese, and you had the merciless, just completely outright slaughter of men, women, and children. It did not matter. There was even a point when two Japanese generals were basically competing in this killing contest, where a Japanese magazine actually kept track of their kills and would publish every week an update on how many of these citizens these two soldiers had killed. This was a very popular thing to talk about. It was almost like talking about a TV show or a movie that everybody had seen, but in this case, it was the death of hundreds and thousands of people. You have thousands of women raped and killed. Pregnant women were not exempt from this. You have horrible crimes against humanity committed with mass graves, people being buried alive, people being set on fire alive, people being used for drill practice in which they would basically have people, Chinese citizens, line up and be fired on by a squad of men. You would have soldiers running up and stabbing people to death. You had Japanese soldiers cutting babies out of pregnant women's wombs as they were alive and screaming. You had people being buried alive for fun. This was not a bright point of Chinese or Japanese history. The range of the dead ranged anywhere from 30,000 to 400,000. And in this picture in the background, you can kind of see these are not rocks that are just kind of piled up. These are skulls of citizens of Nanjing. Needless to say, a lot of people around the world were not pleased, were not necessarily happy with Japan, having found out that this was what's happening. The U.S. in particular puts trade embargoes and economic sanctions onto Japan, basically saying that they were not going to trade with Japan, that they were going to have really high taxes on Japan, that they were going to limit how much economic activity Japan could have around the world until Japan kind of made up for what they had done in Nanjing. So already, the U.S. and Japan are not on great terms. And remember back to World War I, at the end, who were the ones who kind of took Japan out of the Paris Peace Conference? It was the U.S. So relations between Japan and the U.S. were not good leading up to World War II. This is a picture of one of the kind of killing squads. Again, people were lined up, tied down, and shot or stabbed basically just for fun. This is, again, people being buried alive for sport. You have people just standing around watching. And part of the result of those sanctions and embargoes and the U.S.-Japanese relationship is that December 7th, 1941, a naval base, Pearl Harbor specifically in Honolulu, is attacked at around 8 a.m. by Japanese planes. This was a surprise attack. It was not seen coming. Japanese destroyed about 20 American vessels, 8 of which were battleships, and about 300 airplanes, in addition to killing 2,400 soldiers, civilians, etc. 2,400 is the low estimate, by the way. You have, just for some detail, you have an 1,800-pound bomb dropped on the USS Arizona, basically finding its way to their munitions depot, lighting that on fire, creating a larger explosion, sinking the ship with over 1,000 men trapped inside. They were not saved. It's actually soldiers who survived Pearl Harbor when they die, can actually be cremated and have their ashes kind of interred in the Arizona to be with the men they served with. It's something that you can actually learn about if you go to Pearl Harbor, which is kind of a museum, but it's still a base. It's kind of interesting. Now, aircraft carriers were not docked at this base at that time, so our aircraft carriers were not affected, and a large part of our infrastructure, the buildings and stuff there, were largely left alone, which meant that even though this was a devastating attack, it was not necessarily the end-all be-all. There were fixes to it, and it was more of a psychological, more of a kind of brutal attack than anything else. On December 8th, next day, the USA and Britain both declared war on Japan, and 3 days later, the US declared war on Italy and Germany. Now, in February of 1942, Japan took Singapore and 60,000 prisoners of war. Now, the world had seen how Japan was treating prisoners of war, especially Chinese prisoners of war, and time had come to act. General MacArthur, who you guys saw in that video from World War I, was placed in command of the Pacific Theater, or basically the war with Japan. You have the war with Italy and Germany as the European theater, and the war with Japan as the Pacific theater, because it largely took place on islands in the Pacific Ocean. June of 1942, you get the Battle of Midway, in which the U.S. defeated Japan and begins pushing Japan back. Up until June of 1942, Japan had been taking over a lot of the islands in the Pacific, making their way closer and closer to the United States. But the Battle of Midway was where we kind of started fighting back and pushing back against them. The U.S. started using the strategy called island hopping or leapfrogging, where it would basically send troops, send planes, take over an island, and then go to another one immediately, go to another one immediately, go to another one immediately, setting up ports and naval bases until eventually Japan became within range of U.S. bombers. It's important for Japan to be in range of U.S. bombers because if Japan is in range of U.S. bombers, we're not going to be in range of their bombers. So we can keep sending planes to drop bombs on them, and this will become very important later on when we start dropping different kinds of weapons on Japan. Now, around the same time with the U.S. involvement, the tide of war begins to change in North Africa. You have General Montgomery taking command, and even though he's not really necessarily, you don't need to know his name, it's still important to know that 1942, you start to see a shift in British forces against Italians and Germans. At the Battle of El Alamein, on October 1942, you see Italians and Germans start to retreat. Anytime you see troops starting to retreat and pull back, it's always a morale boost for the people pushing forward. In November of 1942, you have Allied forces under General Eisenhower, who would go on to become a future president, take over French Morocco and Algeria and begin to close in on the Axis forces. On May 12th of 1943, the Axis surrendered in North Africa. This is really important because this is a large front of the war now being taken care of. In the European theater, you have a lot of other stuff going on. You have the Winter War, which was a Finnish-Soviet war. Even though the Soviets were on our side, they were still going to war with other people, especially the Finnish, because the Finnish were technically in the Axis War, and this lasted from November 30th, 1939 until March 13th, 1940. Now, the Finnish-Soviet War was really a kind of land grab for the Soviets, but what they were not expecting was a Finnish man named Simo Häyhä, also known as the White Death, who was one of the most decorated and prolific snipers of history, with 505 to 542 confirmed kills. Now, on November 5th of 1941, you had the Enigma Code broken by Alan Turing and his colleagues. Really, it was broken by Poland beforehand, but we give a lot of credit to Britain for doing this because Britain was a little bit more in the forefront. Now, the reason why the Enigma Code is important is because it was a German code for encrypting or hiding their messages from the Allies. And the Allies being able to break this code meant that now the Allies could see what the Germans were saying. They knew their plans, they knew their strategies, they knew all this sort of stuff. This is really important in a war. If you know what your enemy is doing and you don't let on that you know, well, you have an advantage over them. From August of 1942 until February of 1943, you have the Battle of Stalingrad, which ends in a Soviet victory and starts the German retreat out of Russia, or out of the Soviet Union, I should say. This is the bloodiest battle in history with over 800,000 soldiers dead. You also have the Battle of Kursk, which lasted from July of 1943 until August of 1943, which was the largest tank battle in history, which was Germany's last effort on the Eastern Front and the final use of blitzkrieg. The Battle of Kursk was really the end point for Germany and the Soviet Union. And in January 1944, you have the siege of Leningrad, ending with a German defeat. All right, next up, you have the Tehran Conference. The Tehran Conference was a meeting between the Big Three, and the Big Three were Joseph Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. And these three decided the fate of Eastern Europe should the Allies win. So if the Allies were to win, what was going to happen to Poland? What was going to happen to Germany? What was going to happen to all of these different things that were supposed to happen at the end of the war? How was the war going to end? How are they going to make sure that you didn't have another Treaty of Versailles that would just cause World War III? During this time, you also have an emergence of distrust between Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Now, that mistrust was rightly placed because Stalin was not a good person, and Churchill understood that. Churchill saw that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was still a little bit behind the curve on that one, but can't blame him. So the results of the Tehran Conference are Operation Overlord, which we'll talk a little bit about next PowerPoint. The creation of the United Nations, kind of based off the idea of the League of Nations, and the division of Germany once the war was over. And the division of Germany will become very important too because it'll last for about 50 years. Now, from Axis to Ally. July of 1943, U.S. and British troops invaded Sicily, the little island off the coast of Italy. In August of 1943, Sicily surrenders. September 3rd, 1943, Mussolini, who was the leader of the Italian government, is kicked out of office and Italy surrendered to the Allies. Now, on October 13th, 1943, Italy joined the Allies. They kind of switched sides. But northern Italy was still technically under the control of Germany and the Axis powers. So the German army freed Mussolini and put him as the head of a false government. It's basically a puppet government. In June of 1944, Rome was liberated from the Germans, but Mussolini was still kind of in power. Not really, he didn't have any real power, but he was still the head of a quote-unquote government. This marks kind of the real turn for the war, the real kind of movement of the war from being a strict German success after German success after German success to now being, well, the Germans don't necessarily have a chance. If we can keep this momentum going, the Germans will lose soon. And so everybody wanted this to be over quickly for less death, less kind of mayhem, less destruction. And that's what we're going to kind of see next time. So before then, I'd like you guys to continue thinking about what we've talked about and think about how do the events we talked about today in this PowerPoint still affect the world? How do the events of World War II still affect the world today? How do you think the citizens of Nanjing today feel about Japan? How do you think they feel about this act? How does Japan feel about Nanjing? Did they ever apologize? I want you guys to look into that sort of stuff. Now, I know it says story time right here, and we would do that if we were in class, but what I want to draw your attention to is two of the videos that I kind of linked today. One about this guy, Juan Pujol Garcia, and the Night Witches. They're both very interesting stories. I highly encourage you guys to watch them, look them up, learn a little bit more about both because World War II is full of interesting characters, full of interesting people who do crazy things, and I wish we were in the classroom so we could talk about it a little bit more. But again, I just want to keep these PowerPoints short for you guys. I don't want them to be too overbearing, but that's about it for this PowerPoint. Make sure to answer the questions on the quiz. Make sure to keep in track with everything. And as always, if you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, please feel free to reach out. All right, bye.